Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the podcast. Servant Warrior. It's a channel where we talk a lot about chivalry, uh, Japanese Bushido, principles of the warrior ethos, and uh, things like that to kind of get a feel for uh, what it was like to be a warrior in ancient times and how can we translate that into the modern era. And so today on the show, I want to talk about the Scottish Wars of Independence. Um, this is a very interesting time period. Not just on the island of Britain and Scotland, but it was also a advancement in style of warfare uh, that we see take place on the battlefields. You kind of have a melding of two different styles of combat, uh, which is very important and is kind of foreshadowing, if you think about it, really to American independence. And uh, so today is July the 8th, and a couple days ago we just celebrated the anniversary of the independence of the United States from uh, Britain at the time. Uh, but okay, so let's get into this thing here. Um, we're going to talk about a couple of key figures, and I just wanted to go over some of these figures before we even get started, so we kind of know who we're talking about when we're discussing uh, this period of history here. So on the side of Scotland, we have the King of Scots, uh, Alexander II, who dies, and there's no well, he has a heir appointed, but the heir also dies, and so it leaves the crown vacant, and that sets up the whole stage for what is going to occur here. But then let's talk about, or the next person that we're going to talk about is John Balliol, who becomes a puppet for the English crown. Then there's Robert the First, or Robert the Bruce, as he's known, who defeated the English, and I'm not gonna spoil it, but spoiler alert, he won Scottish independence. Now, to note, he's my 22nd great grandfather, uh, and his son and heir to the throne, David II, which is one of my great grand uncles, ascends Robert to the throne after Robert's death, and he's commonly known as the Forgotten King. A lot of people just brush over him really quickly, but he does make an appearance uh, in this time period, of course. So then you have the Scottish nobles. Uh, Among them, you have the Douglases, who were trusted generals. Uh, James the Black Douglas was the most famous one of this period. You have the Mars, who were my 23rd great grandfathers. Uh, you have the Graham, and of course you have Wallace. Everybody knows William Wallace. The Morays, or Murrays as we call them today, were guardians of Scotland, as was William Wallace. And then you have the Stuarts, who at the time at this time actually is when they first started using the surname Stewart. Before, it was based off of the father, so it was Fitz, Walter Fitz Allen, uh, and so in this instance, we have Walter, the sixth High Steward, who was one of the Robert the Bruce's chief executives, and he was my 21st great grandfather. Uh, and then you have um, uh, his son Robert, the seventh High Steward, who was a lieutenant to David II. And so that kind of pretty much sums it up for the side of Scotland. Moving on, we have the English figures, of course, the kings of England who were Plantagenets at the time. Uh, so to start off everything was Edward the First. He was known as Longshanks or the Hammer of the Scots, and he's pretty much the first king to start, um, with this whole incident. Now, oddly enough, he's my 22nd great grandfather. Um, and his son, Edward II, who takes the reign after Edward I dies. And then we have a lot of drama that goes on within the reign of Edward II, uh, which leads to uh, him being replaced by Edward III, who is a first cousin. I think it was 22 or 23 times removed, something like that, of mine. Anyway, okay, so then you move on to the English nobles. Uh, chief among them, well, I wouldn't say chief among them, but one of the ones that we see getting a resurgence is Edward Balliol, who is kin to John Balliol, and he tries to stake a claim again for the Scottish crown. Um, we have the De Bohens, who is the Earl of Hereford. He takes place or is present at a lot of these battles, and he was a 21st great grandfather of mine. The Strathbogies, who were the Earls of Athol, they were displaced, and now they're trying to get their lands back, so they side with England. You'll see a lot of that within some of the nobles of Scotland who had English properties, and during this time, the actual north of England uh, was actually part of Scotland before uh, we think of it, now we think of it as that's obviously all English area, but yeah, during the time period it was actually Scottish area. So this is kind of like a contested area back and forth. Then you have the Dukes of Lancaster. In this instance, we're talking about Henry. Um, and then you have the Warrens, or the Earls of Surrey. They were made guardians of Scotland for England during this time period, and so the one in question here, I believe his name was William. He's actually a 25th great grand uncle by marriage of mine. So that's pretty much the key figures that we're going to discuss. So let's go ahead and delve into the wars. Okay, so it's a period that ranges from 1296 to 1357, and there's various engagements that happen throughout this whole time, and it's broken down into two separate um, two separate wars. uh, so we get what started this whole thing off was 1286. Uh, Alexander the Third, King of Scots, and you'll notice that when you're referring to the kings of Scotland, they don't call themselves kings of Scotland. They call themselves kings of Scots for the people. They are the king of the people, as opposed to in England, where it's just the king of England, so and so. Um, so he dies, 1286. He dies, and he appoints a niece, Margaret of Norway, as the heir. So what happens is Margaret leaves from Norway, comes into Scotland, and I think she makes it to the Orkney Islands, and she's really bad sick on the journey, and she dies. So there's no heir, and so now you have an open crown, open throne. This is where Edward the First of England steps in. He signs a treaty. So Scotland sets up these guardians, and it's kind of like regents, um, where they're making the decisions until there's an actual king that's crowned. And so Edward the First signs a treaty with these guardians at Bergam for Margaret to marry his son Edward of Carnarvon, who is Edward the Second. This is before Margaret dies, of course. Um, and so, but in this treaty, that this marriage proposal treaty here, Scotland explicitly puts in the treaty that they're going to remain separate and divided from England, because this would essentially make, whenever Edward the First dies, it would make Edward the Second, purported King of England and King of Scotland, and Scotland says nope, 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 not gonna happen, not gonna happen. So we move forward. Again, Margaret's making her way to Scotland, and in 1290 is around about the time when she's making it to land here. And like I said, she dies before being crowned. Now there's 13 rivals that are in play for succession to the crown, but chief among those is Robert the Bruce, who is the fifth Lord Annandale. This is the grandfather of Robert the Bruce, that the famous Robert the Bruce, the King of Scots, that we'll see come later on. And then there's John Balliol, who's Lord of Galloway. Now, to avoid civil war, the Guardians, they wrote to Edward the First to arbitrate this discussion of over the claim to the throne. And so, a year later, Edward agrees, but there's contention because he's demanding that he wants to be recognized as Lord Paramount of Scotland. So this means is he's coming in and he's taking control of Scottish business, politics, economy, everything. So he's essentially like a king. The Guardians refused. Uh, and so Edward threatens 3 weeks. He gives them 3 weeks to comply. And as he's doing this, he's actually mobilizing his army. So he's thinking ahead. He's getting ready for battle because he knows they're going to refuse. So then he forces the claimants to make that acknowledgement of him being, a Lord Paramount of Scotland, and to get that allegiance to Edward. And like I said before, these nobles, they had land in England, so they had to submit, because if not, then they would lose their lands. They lose their lands, they lose their wealth, and nobody wants to be poor. So Edward now has assumed role as Lord Paramount. And first thing he does is he takes all the castles and he puts them under English control. He makes all the Scottish officials resign their office, and Edward appoints whoever he wants to whatever position. If it's the same person that goes back in the same position, they're in that position, because of it's the will of King Edward the First. Then he assembles and calls for all the nobles to gather and to pledge allegiance and pay homage to Edward the First, and then they start holding these. Uh, they have what's known as the Great Cause, where uh, these claimants are presenting their cases, and Edward rejected all but Bruce, Balliol, uh, Flourish the Viscount of Holland, uh, and John Lord Hastings, because they were the only ones that could prove a direct descent to David the First, who preceded Alexander the Third. So Balliol and Bruce are both asked to compile up documents, and they're given 40 arbiters each to help them with this. Edward too is doing the same thing, and he's compiling up his claim to the throne to see who can have the better claim. So we move forward, and it's November of 1292. Balliol is actually named king and crowned on 30th of November, and Balliol is made to swear allegiance to Edward the First, and Edward then goes on to declare Scotland a vassal state, which means that Edward has the ultimate say in everything that Scotland does. Now, this causes resentment to grow against England and Balliol, of course, and the Bruces are able to use this to begin to grow a faction to undermine the English hand in Scottish politics. So we're going to fast forward 1294. Uh, Edward is demanding Scottish troops and money to invade France from Balliol. And so Balliol convenes a council, and he was advised to defy the command. And so then they started to convene a war council. Um, Balliol turns and warns France, and a treaty is signed with France to attack England, contingent on any invasion uh, of by England of France. And so then France also says that they would support Scotland. This is what's known as the Old Alliance. Uh, Marriage proposals were set in place between Balliol's son and Philip's niece Joan. The following year, Edward discovers this plot, and so he sends troops to the northern border to strengthen up his defenses there in fear of this preemptive Scottish invasion. Then Edward appoints Robert Bruce, the sixth Lord of Annandale. This is King Robert's father, as governor of Carlisle Castle. Carlisle Castle is again right there around the border areas of the contested area between Scotland and England to the north. Um, and then he orders Balliol to relinquish control of Berwick, Jedburgh, and Roxburgh. So it's really starting to heat up here. Edward assembles a militia in Newcastle, and he sends a force north by boat. Um, and Balliol summons all able-bodied males to bear arms and to assemble uh, as a militia. And there's several that ignore this order. Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, the future king, his estates were seized by Balliol and given to John Comyn, or as they call him, John the Red. And so Robert the Bruce, or Robert Bruce, is one of those that ignored this order. So now it's 1296, and the war begins. There's 4 phases. You have the English invasion, you have the Wallace campaigns, you have Robert the Bruce campaigns, then you have several diplomatic and military initiatives, both in Ireland, Scotland, as well as north of England, which leads to the conclusion of the War of 1306. So Edward the First takes Berwick Castle and defeats Balliol and forces abdication. The nobles are forced to pay homage, and the Stone of Destiny is taken to Westminster. Now, the Stone of Destiny is where all of the Scottish kings are crowned, and so essentially, by Edward taking this stone, uh, there could be no King of Scots. There could be no King of Scots. So it's like a a psychological ploy here as well. Now Wallace starts to or begins up his revolts with de Moray or Murray, which results in victory at Stirling Bridge. This is a shock to the English troops. Moray, he was wounded and he dies there at Stirling Bridge or in Stirling there. But so they continue to raid northern England. In at 1298, Wallace is named Guardian of Scotland. Now Wallace was of noble birth, so he came from a noble family, but he had no titles, he had no land. All that went to his older brother. He is the second son of his father, so all that went to his older brother. So he's pretty much, just a landless, poor uh, second son of a noble family. Um, and so this is a great opportunity for him to get recognition and to, uh, be honored, given honors of uh, land grants. Um, but Edward, he invades Scotland again, and he's met at Falkirk, uh, and England wins at Falkirk. Uh, and he leaves and goes back to England without properly subduing Scotland. And I say that uh, not to be on the side of either or, um, but he surprisingly he doesn't take it any further, and it's at this point where Wallace goes into hiding, because they're actively looking for Wallace actually, and so we fast forward till the following year, 1299, and Robert Bruce, future king, and John Comyn are both made guardians jointly. Now, remember, John Comyn is the one that got the Bruce's lands, uh, and so to keep things at a more or less peaceful and agreeable level, they also appoint the Bishop of Lamberton as a neutral. He's kind of like the third man on the team to sway, the decisions one way or the other. So both France and Rome are pressuring Edward to release Balliol, who is imprisoned, and Wallace is actually sent to France to get help. And so this back and forth is going on, in interim, and then so we're coming up now on 1304. There's a short truce that's interrupted by the siege of Stirling Castle by England. So England comes in and they lay a siege to Stirling Castle. Most of the Scottish nobles surrender and plead allegiance to Edward. And by 1305, which is the following year, Wallace is actually captured, and as we know, he's executed. This sparks this fury within the Scottish people, and so there's a bit of a lull, and Robert the Bruce steps up to the plate in 1306, the following year, and he holds out in defiance. Now Bruce he meets with Comyn at Greenfriars, and they argue over their claims, and Robert wants to strike a deal between him and Comyn, and they're trying to vie for, again, they want, Balliol's not effective, so they want independent Scotland with its own king, and so they have to discuss on who's gonna seek this claim. Now Robert obviously has the better claim here, uh, which I do say that as being kind of prejudiced in the matter, but so Robert finds out that Comyn has actually informed on him to Edward, and so Edward knows that Robert is resisting, and Robert kills Comyn in a church, or in the church there when he meets him. Um, so you fast forward 5 weeks, around about the time that Robert the Bruce is on the run. He's trying to gather support, and he gets uh, support of the nobles and clergy, and he's crowned King of Scots. Now, this is done so without the the crowning stone, the Stone of Destiny. But hey, that's you know, you got to do what you got to do. So he starts to engage in little skirmishes, and Robert was actually defeated at Methven. Uh, and it was here at Methven that he starts to retreat, and he's declared an outlaw by Edward. Edward goes on to kidnap his wife and queen, and daughter Marjorie. Now, I didn't mention them before, but they are also an important part of the story, as we'll see. Um, so Robert goes off to the islands, and he's trying to grow his forces. He's trying to train and just bide his time. And eventually he returns to the mainland around about the same time as Edward the First dies. So it's 1307. So it's following year. And Robert goes on to have victories at Loudon Hill, Pass of Brander, and captures both Roxburgh and Edinburgh Castle. And then, we have the Bannockburn victory in 1314, which was a pivotal event. And it was through this um, that Robert's wife and daughter were ransomed back. And it was Walter, the Sixth High Steward, who was sent to bring them back from England. Uh, Now, Walter later marries Marjorie, the daughter, and their son starts, Robert II, he starts the Stuart dynasty in Scotland. Uh, so let's fast forward, continuing, it's 1318, and they actually capture Berwick Castle again. And English forces are expelled. They hold it for quite a good while. And so then we come up to a little bit of the ending or we think it's going to be the end here. Uh, and so the Scottish nobles send a letter to Pope John the 22nd in Rome, uh, which is known as the Declaration of Broth. And this is a very important document, very important document. And basically, it's affirming Scottish independence from England and their desire to choose their own king. So they're supporting, in this letter, they openly support Bruce as their king. And it, like I said, they're claiming Scottish independence, and they're claiming freedom, not just to choose their ruler, but freedom from the incursion of other countries, namely England, uh, into their political entity. Now, this is like I said, this is a very important document, not just for Scotland, but for America as well, because this will actually be an example uh, that inspired uh, the Declaration of Independence of America from Great Britain. And so the most important phrase here that was is the most inspiring phrase or part of this document reads as follows: "For as long as we are but 100 of us remain alive, never will we, in any conditions, be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." Wow. Wow. So 1324, after they're having to do a lot of politicking in Rome, and so it's 1324, and the Pope actually recognizes Robert as King of Scots. Now, we fast forward, so Robert is ruling, he's doing his thing there, and we're moving forward to 7 years later, or actually, it's 1327, and Edward II, he dies. Um, the Bruces, they continue the raids on England, and they almost capture Edward III, who is takes Edward II's place, obviously. Now, the deal with Edward II, there's a lot of contention on what happened, but he was actually forced to abdicate. Edward II was forced to abdicate and deposed, and he was, yeah, he died, quote unquote. Some people think he was murdered. Who knows? Who knows? But anyway, uh, Edward III takes the place, and after they almost capture Edward III, they have the Treaty of Edinburgh, sorry, and Northampton, which is in 1328, and it recognizes Bruce as the sole King of Scots and Scotland as an independent nation, and Bruce's heir, David, which is his son, uh, marries Edward III's sister. So Edward goes on ahead and recognizes the Bruce's claim, and to submit this kind of, peaceful coexistence, as often is the case. They marry off a sister, or aunt, or whoever, a female of the royal family to another royal family, and this kind of was you know commonplace uh, in that time and era, and so we see it in this example also. Which brings us to so that's the end of that, and so you have several years into or after that, you begin or they begin the second war for Scottish independence. So it's not over yet. The England has not loosened their grip yet. Um, Even though they signed the treaty, and they're saying that Bruce's are the kings, and Scotland's free and independent from English hands, but it's just something that they just never is let to bear. So there's a second war that takes place, and this runs from 1332 to 1357. So it's a few years after the fact. And so what causes this is that Robert the Bruce dies, and so his son David II takes the crown, but he's too young, so he has to have a regent. And at that time, they put in place the new Earl of Moray. Now, Edward III begins plotting with Edward Balliol, who was John Balliol's son, to overthrow the Bruce crown, and he's gathered support of the disinherited Scottish nobles who sided with England during the First War because they had English properties. Now, uh, King Robert took these Scottish nobles' land and gave it to people who were noble uh, and loyal to the Bruce uh, dynasty, or the Robert the Bruce, and were loyal to Scotland. Uh, so they're kind of not really happy about having their lands taken away, but what's fair is fair. So to make things worse, the Earl of Moray dies, and the Earl of Mar is elected new regent. So now Balliol begins to mobilize, and Edward tells him, "Hey, look, you're gonna have to take your forces by sea. You can't invade by land because it's gonna fall back on me. And if you fail, I'm gonna deny everything here." So he's got this deniability clause, and so that's what Balliol does. He sets sail, and they land at Fife. Uh, and or well, they land, and then at Fife actually is where he's met by a force near Perth. Now, the Earl of Mar has close ties with not just the Bruces but the Stuarts as well, and they become sort of like the 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 regents, or all the regents are pooled between Moray and the Mar earldoms, and the Mars will actually go on to be like the quote unquote nannies of the future uh, heirs of the Scottish uh, crown, but they've also have a working system of intelligence, and they're monitoring this English buildup. So they're at Perth now, and they're uh, met on the road by Scottish forces, and Balliol, to surprise everybody, he actually wins at Dublin Moor, and this is where we see a change in battle tactics. This is something that we start to see on mainland Europe, not so much in English fighting. Balliol has learned something here, and he's applied what he's learned. And so what he does is he at his center he uses dismounted knights in full armor. So you have armored infantry, um, and on the flanks he has archers, and these archers are just hailing these lightly armored Scottish uh, infantrymen, which that's mostly what they had at the time was just plain light armored infantrymen uh, on the side of Scotland, and they were just decimating them on the fields. And it's hard enough to fight someone who is fully protected in plate armor. Uh, it's you have it's very brutal. It's very brutal. Um, and so you have to have a lot of blunt force trauma, which uh, isn't on the onset fatal, but it can be with enough bashing. You have to bash, pretty much bash their helmet off their head. Um, but now some of the lances and swords can penetrate armor if thrusted at the right angle. But it's not as easy to pull off when someone's actively trying to take your head off. So it's not saying it's not possible, but it's not easy. Okay, um, which they were well versed in fighting during that time there. Uh, but the Earl of Mar, him and a lot of many nobles actually die on this battlefield at Dublin Moor. And Balliol has himself installed as king and crowned as King of Scotland. Now Edward was uh, surprised by this whole deal, and he obviously didn't think Balliol was going to succeed at this. I mean, who would? uh, but nonetheless, he's fearful of a pending invasion, so he actually moves a force to the northern border there, just as a contingency. One thing I guess he's learned from the Scots is that you just never know. So in steps Archibald Douglas, and he's made a new guardian. He initiates a truce and make a truce with Balliol to let Parliament assemble and decide who was actually the rightful king. Again, there's this Balliol and Bruce contention. Balliol thinking that he's actually got the right to rule and not the Bruces. Uh, and so in doing this, Balliol says, "Okay, that's fine." But in the interim, he goes around and boasts of how, with the support of England and through English greatness, uh, that he was able to do what he was able to do. But in doing so, he also releases his English forces. He sends them back to England, and so he's saying that it's because of England that I was able to do this, and he gives Berwick Castle back to England to England and to Edward III, and declared Scotland as a fiefdom of England, saying that it had always been a fiefdom of England. And then he goes on even further to pledge service to England. It doesn't really bid well with the Scots, and Douglas attacks Balliol, and Baliol is forced to flee naked back to Carlisle. Uh, so we have Edward and Baliol. They seize Berwick Castle, and Douglas is killed at Halidon Hill. Uh, King David is now moved to Dumbarton Castle for safekeeping, and Berwick and the lowlands Scotland, uh, they pretty much fall to English rule. Uh, so, fearing capture and the assassination of David, they send the Guardians send David to France. Uh, and there's no clear, decisive battles that take place, but there's a lot of raiding action by England during this period of time here, and a lot of the nobles that were loyal to England are now defecting to the Bruce side, uh, especially the Earl of Athol. um, Andrew Murray is appointed a new guardian, and he's unable to reach a treaty. And France starts to threaten to invade England and support Scots if they don't let up. If England doesn't let up on this whole deal. And so Edward III says, well, you know what? I'm invading France. I have a claim to the throne of France, and so I'm going to assert my right as would be king of France, which starts the Hundred Years' War uh, with France. This kind of gave Scotland a little bit of time to regain some control, and 1335, the Battle of Coblin was a decisive victory, and it put an end to this Balliol claim and attempts at the crown for a little bit, so that this whole situation is kind of put to bed. Uh, they give it a little bit of time to make sure that everything's, quiet. And so it's 1341, and David II is returned to Scotland. And, he continues to raid England for France because uh, England is at Calais, and France asks for help to kind of get relief from the siege of Calais, and so David agrees, and he goes in and attacks northern Scotland, or I'm sorry, northern England, and he's trying to make his way into England to cause havoc and force Edward to uh, engage him and kind of give the French a little bit of relief. Uh, Now, David II is actually injured and captured at Neville Cross, and he's remains captured for over 11 years. And now, during this time, Scotland is being ruled by Robert Stewart, who's the seventh High Steward at this time. And it's actually Robert who will come to the throne on the death of David. Um, but uh, Baliol, yeah, Baliol comes back again, and he's trying to attempt another invasion of Scotland, but he fails. And so this is that was in 1356, which the following year David's released, and Scotland is forced to pay a heavy ransom. And so they go. They have a little back and forth about it, but they pay the first installment. And David says, "You know what? I'm not doing this no more. I'm not paying England anymore." And so on the second installment, he actually takes that money and he spends it, for Scotland. Kind of makes England mad, and throws Scottish Parliament under the bus here. Um, and so all but a small sum remained unpaid after his death in 1377, when when Parliament was able to pay a little bit on it, and finally they said, you know what, this is it. But at the time of his ransom, they actually had the Stone of Destiny ransomed as well, and so it was returned back to Scotland. So now you have, they have their ability to crown their kings again, and so that kind of pretty much, in a nutshell, sums up the Scottish independence. I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff that I might have missed, or didn't get a chance to really delve into. Again, this is a very, very extensive um, time period here, and I know we're coming up on the hour, and I didn't want to drag this out for too much longer here, but so we see the development of this need for the assertion of freedom, the assertion of Scottish independence as its own independent nation, separate from England, separate from English control, separate from English rule, and we looked at the key players in the Scottish Wars, and we looked at the Declaration of Broth. We compared that to the Declaration of Independence. Um, we talked about the two different phases of the Scottish Wars for independence, um, and we also talked about that interesting little adventure of the Balials and how um, they started to use a different style of warfare. Now, typically, the Scots during this time, they actually used more of a guerrilla style warfare. They didn't want to engage the English in these large pitched battles. So, they did little skirmishes, and um, they were not as heavily armored uh, as the English. The English relied heavily on actual, cavalry charges, and the Scots had their cavalry, but I don't think it was on par with English cavalry. English cavalry was very, very strong during that time. And then, later in the Hundred Years' War, they'll develop the longbow, and the longbow would become a turning uh, point in medieval warfare. Uh, so, yeah, it's a very interesting time period there, and you see the backwards and forwards of politics during the time, and actually Scottish history is very interesting if you really delve into detail between the interactions with other nations and with themselves in general. Um, as I kind of pointed out here, I am of Scottish ancestry, but I'm also have English ancestry, and uh, a very diverse mixture actually of European, uh, Native American, and uh, things like that. So yeah, it's interesting into seeing how different periods in history play out. Uh, and I really didn't talk much about chivalry in this case, or things of that nature. But I would say that in the instances of like Stirling Castle, the siege, and things like that, the Robert the Bruce's brother, is famously purported to have handled himself as a gentleman to the English and uh, to Bowen, and um, he gives them ample time to uh, restock and to get reinforcements to the castle uh, before they attack. And they conducted themselves in very honorable and chivalrous way. Even though at the end of the day they were trying to kill each other, uh, uh, and they were enemies, but they conducted themselves with such honor. And so, I didn't really speak of that specifically when I talked about the history of it, but it was there. It was there. It was sort of a thing that was just innate at that time. The, the warriors were developed, the nobles were developed at that time, and um, it wasn't just exclusive to England. The Scottish nobles, most of them were of Norman extraction as well. The Bruces were definitely, the Stuarts were definitely, they came from France with the Duke of Normandy, or William the Conqueror, as he's known, and so they would have still had this level of sophistication in that they respected uh, the rules of chivalry of the day, especially in combat. And so, uh, you know, I, I want to I wanted just to take a snippet of this and kind of reflect back on it. Being that we just celebrated our anniversary of our independence of the United States from Britain, I thought this would be a little nice touch to go back even further in history. There are a lot of Scots here in the United States, and uh, that Scottish warrior ethos and spirit is still alive in each and every one of us who are of Scottish ancestry. It's kind of, people would say it's kind of coded in our DNA. I don't know how true that would be, but yeah, I mean, so with that, I'll go ahead and close the show. Thank you again for tuning in. If you like the content of this podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe. That you know we want to tickle the algorithm here a little bit, and lets me know what kind of content you guys like. Uh, Helps me to kind of dial in a little bit as well. But so yeah, bid everyone farewell, and hope to see you back in the next podcast here. Stay tuned. I've got a lot more in store for you guys and gals.